In this video, I'm going to talk about two different airplanes that never saw combat, but I thought the comparison might be interesting because in 1944, the United States Navy thought it would be interesting to compare the F4U Corsair and the FW-190. And the reason for this was because the Navy was getting ready to support the landings in southern France, which would take place later that year. And they wanted to gather data on how Navy fighters, U.S. Navy fighters, compared against the premier fighters of the German Luftwaffe. And the test actually includes the F6F Hellcat as well as the Corsair, but I'm going to focus on the Corsair and the FW-190 A4 and A5. So most people, when they look at these kinds of airplanes, it's taken for granted that the Navy airplanes or the carrier-based airplanes are heavier because they need more structure to support the landing gear and the hard landings you make on an aircraft carrier. So the question I began to ask myself was, or were these two airplanes ever flown against each other in a test environment and or mock combat? And if so, what were the results? So I'm going to start with the Corsair, one of my favorite airplanes from World War II, and then I'll talk about the development of the FW-190, and then we'll get into the actual results from the test. So in January 1944, the Navy began a comparison test between the F6F Hellcat, the Dash 3, and the F4U-4 Corsair. That was the airplane they wanted to use, and in reality, they only had the F4U-1. Airplanes are pretty much the same. The big difference between the Dash 4 and the Dash 1 is the Dash 4 has a four-bladed prop and the Malcolm hood canopy, and I'll show you that in a second. And the Dash 4 has, like I said, the four-bladed prop. So this is just the cover of the evaluation, which was classified secret at the time. So the Corsair came about from a Navy requirement in 1938 to design a high-speed fighter. And Vought decided to compete in the competition. They went and found the biggest engine they could find at the time, which was the R2800. In those days, it produced 1,800 horsepower, and the production airplanes it produced 2,000 horsepower. And then they went to Hamilton Standard, one of the propeller manufacturers, and said, how big a propeller do we need to get the most power or the thrust out of this engine? So the Hamilton Standard people said you need a 13 foot by 4 inch propeller, which meant that's a pretty big propeller, which means you need long landing gear, and the Vought engineers went back to the drawing table. The true story of how the bent wing of the F4U Corsair, of which this is a model of one, how this came about, this is known as the gull wing, was the fact that they were sitting around a coffee table and somebody said, what happens if we bend the wing down and then up, and at the base of the wing, we put the landing gear. This way we can use a shorter landing gear that's lighter, it takes up less room in the airplane when it's retracted, and oh, by the way, we can still use the big propeller. So that's what happened. The rest of the design is history, and the Corsair was the first piston engine airplane built in the United States that exceeded 400 miles an hour in level flight, and did that in October 1940. Vought got the first production orders in the end of November 1940, and they started building them actually before we entered the war. So the first Corsairs, when they were built, had what they call a short nose, and so during flight testing, after they got to production order, they extended a nose about 3 feet, which led to one of its nicknames is hose nose. And the airplane also wound up with an engine that had water injection, which increased the power. If we went from 2,000 horsepower to 2,400 horsepower for short periods of time. And they changed the canopy from what they call the bird cage, which has all this structure around the pilot, to a clear, what's known as a Malcolm hood. And that's the F4U-1A. And the other cool thing about this airplane is it had a pretty healthy payload in terms of external stores. It could carry 4,000 pounds. The other thing that's interesting about this airplane is it's the one that was in production the longest, and the last one was built in January 1953. So the Corsair had a few problems when it first came out. It went whistling through the flight tests. It met all the performance specs. They even tested it landing on the carriers, but when it got in the hands of the fleet pilots as opposed to test pilots, we began to have problems. And what had happened is the oleos that on the landing gear were too stiff, as they learned later, and the airplane would bounce when the pilot cut the engine and bounce back up in the air, and there you were 15, 20 feet off the carrier deck, out of airspeed and out of ideas, and you tended to come crashing down, bending the prop, sometimes really damaging the airplane. So they went back to the drawing board. The other big addition was what they call the Malcolm hood, which I talked about, which gave you much better visibility, got rid of the birdcage. So Vought launched a program called DOG, and it did several different things. One of which is it fixed the problems with the landing gear. It allowed the pilot to raise a seat much higher in the cockpit, so on carrier landings, when he had the canopy back, he could see better over the nose. And they also fixed some problems with leaky actuators in the cowls that were sending oil and hydraulic fluid back over the canopy. So by this time, the airplane was already in service. The Marines had been using it for a while. In fact, it flew its first combat missions in February 1943, and the Marines loved the airplane because it outperformed the Zero by a wide margin, and it had long legs. It could go with external tanks, it could go 500-600 miles one way, fight, and then fly back. So this is the production. Roughly 12,570 Corsairs were built, most of which were built by Vought. Goodyear built 4,000 of them, and then Brewster built 735. And the interesting thing about the Brewster Corporation was that they built all these Corsairs, and then the Navy had them delivered to Goodyear to be fixed. And none of those airplanes ever saw fleet use. They're the only ones that have the pure bubble canopy. It was another indication of the quality problems that Brewster had as a manufacturer that began in the 1930s. So let's go to our German counterpart. And this is the Focke-Wulf 190. This is from in the markings of Jagdstaffel II, which is one of the famous German fighter groups from World War II. And the German Air Force wanted to create another airplane that would supplement the Me-109, which was their standard fighter. And so they issued a contract to Focke-Wulf, and Kurt Tonk was the designer. And the interesting thing is the primary reason that Focke-Wulf got the contract is they didn't have any major contracts to build airplanes. So Tonk started with a clean sheet of paper, and it's the only German fighter that has a radial engine in it. And he had there's a lot of really interesting innovations in this airplane. One of which is the fact it was the first airplane with a vacuum-formed canopy, so it's totally clear. This is before the P-51Ds came out and the P-47s came out in 1943. The other thing is heavily armed. It had 2 machine guns in the nose, 4 cannon, 2 in each wing, and it had a wide track landing gear, which solved some of the problems that the Me-109 has. In fact, the Me-109 is known for having more operational landing accidents than they lost in combat. And another innovation was in the cockpit. And I'll talk more about this in a second, and it was the single control for throttle, RPM, and mixture. So this airplane started flying combat missions in June 1941, and it was an ugly surprise to the RAF. In several engagements, they shot down lots of Spitfires without any losses. And it was another year before the Spitfires that the FW-190 clearly outperformed, and the Spit-9s began to show up that their RAF had a fighter equal to the A model of the Focke-Wulf 190. So one of the innovations that Tonk had was on the right side you can see the single circle, and it's a single control that controls the pitch of the propeller blades, the mixture of fuel being fed to the engine, and how much power you want out of the engine. So basically you had to just shove it up, pull it back, depending on what you want to do. On the other side, you see the cockpit of the Corsair, and the Navy practice as well as the RAF practices. You had a throttle, then you had a prop control, and then you had a mixture control. So when you advance the throttle, you had to basically advance the mixture first, then the RPM, and then the throttle. Or if you're coming back, the sequence is exactly the opposite. Throttle back, adjust the RPM, adjust the mixture. Now, the R2800 had auto lean and auto rich features where you could just put the mixture in one of those 2 positions, but you still could fine-tune the propeller using the RPM lever. What to me is astounding is that almost 24,000 Focke-Wulf 190s were built, and that's of 23 different models between 1940 and 1945. And on the right here you can see some of them. We're going to focus on what I call the short nose or the A versions. There's a D where they replaced the radial engine, which the Luftwaffe had problems with. The BMW radial engine was not as reliable as the inline, and so they began to replace them. And that's the D series or D9s, known as the Dora 9s. But the first versions of the Focke-Wulf, the A models, all had a radial engine, and some of them were equipped to drop torpedoes. They were equipped to be dive bombers. Some of them even had 30mm cannon out in the wings to replace the 20mm cannon to give it more firepower when it was trying to attack bombers over Germany. So they made a lot of these things, I guess my point. What was also interesting is in 1942, a Luftwaffe pilot, quote, got lost and landed in Wales in a brand new Focke-Wulf 190A. It was an A3 to be precise. And the RAF started testing it. And it confirmed everything that the Spitfire V pilots were telling them that this airplane outperformed anything that was in the RAF. So while the Royal Air Force was working on getting the Spit 9 into service, the RAF issued two actual specifications, one of which wound up as becoming what we now know as the Hawker Fury and the Hawker Sea Fury. Those airplanes weren't built until 1945, but the fact of the matter is the RAF realized that the Spitfire's future was in doubt, particularly when compared to airplanes like the FW-190. And the other interesting thing is this airplane was kept in a tremendous amount of secrecy, although it did allow pilots from the United States Army Air Force to fly it in the summer of 1942. What a lot of people don't know is that 6 other air forces besides the Germans flew the FW-190 operationally. So France is the one that surprised the heck out of me when I was doing the research, because at the end of the war, they bought or captured enough materials and parts and drawings, and they actually built 70 of these things that they wanted to fly by the French Air Force. It was one part of trying to get French aircraft production restarted after the war, but they actually did fly these airplanes. The Hungarians flew them against the Soviets because they were allied with Germany. Romania did the same until they were the king withdrew them from the Axis alliance and they switched sides. Spain had several squadrons flying them in against the Soviets, and the Soviet Union captured a bunch at the end of the war and flew them. Soviet naval aviation, the Baltic, flew them. And then the last one that also surprised me was the Turks acquired 72 of them during the war, and then they flew them until 1947. And the only reason they took them out of service was they were starting to have trouble getting parts. The United States Navy tested an FW-190, and the question is which one. So as I was doing the research, one of the things I found out was that some people say it's an A4, some people say it's an A5, some people say it's a G3. There are some minor differences between the A4 and the A5 and the G3, which I'll get into in a second. So one report, the Navy report, says it was serial number 2900. Well, there's no such thing as a serial number 2900 in the Focke-Wulf serial number registry. I have this picture here when I found it on the web, says it's serial number 150051, and again, it's not in the Focke-Wulf registry. So the question is what is the airplane? So actually, it was a FW-190 G3. It was captured at Monte Caverno airfield outside Salerno right after the invasion. It was captured literally intact, undamaged. There are no holes in it. It was flown back to or shipped back to the United States. The serial number, by the way, is 160057. And it was assigned to the Schnellkampfgeschwader Squadron 10, which is a fighter bomber squadron. And this is characteristic or in tune with the G3 model, which is about 6 inches longer than an A model. And it's got extra racks and ordnance stations on the wings. And the additional length in the fuselage is designed to enhance the CG envelope so it can carry more ordnance. Anyways, brought back to Patuxent River, Maryland for testing. It was taken apart, examined in detail, repainted, and this is a picture of it in flight that was taken during the test. And the Navy actually flew it against the F4F Wildcat, the F6F Hellcat, and the F4U Corsair. So I just thought this would be interesting if you start looking at some numbers, because this surprised me in terms of the relative performance of the airplane. I include the performance of the FW-190D9, that's the one with the inline engine, only because it was among the largest number built, and I wanted to see how it compared to the earlier model because it was actually a better fighter. So when you look at this, you can see that the Corsair has some advantages, at least from a numbers perspective. What surprised me is that above 20,000 feet, the FW-190 was faster, and also its rate of climb at 10,000 and 20,000 feet was actually better. Below those altitudes, the Corsair was superior. And also the armament of the FW-190 is pretty healthy. You've got 420mm cannons, you've got versus the 650 caliber machine guns. And the 420mm cannons are augmented by the two 13mm, which are pretty close to a little bigger than 50 caliber in the nose. So you've got a pretty heavily armed airplane. When the Navy started flying the FW-190 against the Corsair, they found some interesting things that I think surprised them. And when I was reading about it, I was kind of blown away by it. So the Corsair is known for its ability to climb. Well, so is the FW-190. And so if you're climbing at 160 knots, the FW-190 climbs faster than the Corsair. If you climb at 130 knots, it's reversed. So the best rate of climb airspeed for the Corsair is 130. The best rate of climb airspeed for the Focke-Wulf 190 is 160. Again, I mentioned it's slightly faster above that, and also in the cockpit. So the pilot's sitting up here, and what the Luftwaffe did in both the Me-109 and the FW-190 is they had the pilot's feet up a little bit. So what that helps do is reduce the effective G-forces. So when you roll into an angle bank and you pull back on the stick and you start increasing G on the airplane, with your feet up, that means that your blood doesn't rush as quickly to your feet. The second thing is the controls in the cockpit, there's fewer of them, and it's much simpler than in the Corsair, which was beginning to start seeing the standardization that we see in my generation of aircraft, but the Corsair's cockpit is more cluttered, has more stuff in it. So the interesting things is what happens when you get in a dogfight. So the airplanes roll about the same, but when they do a loop, in other words, you go up around over the top like this, what would happen is the FW-190 couldn't follow the Corsair, and so he'd either shoot out or stall, and which meant that the Corsair could get away if he was looping to get away. In any kind of turning engagement, the Corsair turned easily behind the FW-190. And in fact, what was startling to me is when they set up engagements, wingtip to wingtip, fights on, both guys either turn right or left, but if they turn towards each other, within 2 turns, the Corsair was behind the FW-190. If they started behind like this, it was not even a fair fight because the FW-190 couldn't outturn the Corsair and turn in him and shoot it down. The other thing is in a head-on fight, it would take less than 3 turns to go from this position to this position. So the other thing that they learned was while the controls on the FW-90 to control the engine made it simpler, you just push one lever up, pull one lever back, it made fine-tuning the engine control or the power you're getting from the engine a little bit more difficult, which meant that when you're flying in close formation like this or like this, it was harder to control the engine, and so you had to separate it out. So back when I was going through the training command, we flew T-28s as students with 10 feet of separation, step down, 20 feet of trail, and then you worked your way to 10 and 10. So with the FW-190, that's much more difficult because you're all over the sky when you're trying to make fine power adjustments. So at the end of this, the conclusion was that had these two airplanes wound up in combat with each other, given the fact that both pilots, I'll use the word loosely, equal, then the Corsair theoretically should win. Again, in most dogfights, it all starts with where you are versus the other guy. So if he doesn't see you, you're climbing up from behind, you can easily shoot him down. But if you're starting like head on, or you're starting wingtip to wingtip, or one's diving on the other, then the fight's on, and this airplane should win pretty much every time, given the fact that the two pilots are equal in skill. So if you like this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and all kinds of comments are appreciated, and I answer pretty much every one of them. So thank you much, and enjoy watching my other videos.